We've made it through 2 complete chapters and 72 pages, and now at last we come to the first apologetic argument in this book of apologetics. And in true Genesis fashion, Geisler and Turek is going to start with a cosmological argument, or as I like to call it, the cosmological fallacy. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. The first 2 chapters of the book put a lot of effort into trying to bring readers into a receptive frame of mind by mocking educators and philosophers and by spreading various conspiracy theories about how Christians is supposedly being persecuted and oppressed. And with all that garbage out of the way, we're finally going to start getting down to what they think is the evidence that supposedly proves it takes more faith to be an atheist than to be a Christian. And I'm here for it. I can't wait. So let's dive right in. Chapter 3 begins with the story how physicists and astronomers came to the conclusion that the current presentation of the universe had its origin about 13.8 billion years ago at an event popularly known as the Big Bang. Or at least that's roughly how Chapter 3 begins, although to hear Geisler and Turek tell the story, it's all about how physicists like Albert Einstein desperately wanted the universe to be eternal and unchanging and had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the conclusion that it had a beginning, which is as close as Geisler and Turek ever do come to admitting that yes, in fact, scientists follow the evidence wherever it leads, thank you very much. Geisler and Turek's going to forget this fact later on, but for the moment it suits their narrative to acknowledge it, so they do so. But I have to share this part of the story because it's kind of amusing. Quote, in 1929, Einstein made a pilgrimage to Mount Wilson to look through Hubble's telescope for himself. What he saw was irrefutable. The observational evidence showed that the universe was indeed expanding as general relativity had predicted. With his cosmological constant now completely crushed by the weight of the evidence against it, Einstein could no longer support his wish for an eternal universe. End quote. That's right, folks. According to Geisler and Turek, Albert Einstein found out the universe is actually expanding because he looked through a telescope and saw it visibly expanding. Well, the story of how scientists actually discovered the expansion of the universe is a fascinating tale of research and analysis, but this ain't that. You can't look through a telescope and visibly see the universe expand. Geisler and Turek may have read about how physicists derived the Big Bang Theory, but either they didn't understand it, or else they's indulging in the apologist's favorite pastime of rewriting stories to better suit their brand. Needless to say, either way, we shouldn't trust Geisler and Turek to explain the science behind Big Bang cosmology, because they ain't going to get it right. Maybe it's because they can't, maybe it's because they don't want to, but they ain't going to get it right. Fortunately, we don't really need to get into the scientific details right now, because Geisler and Turek jumps straight from here into the cosmological argument. Quote, the cosmological argument is the argument from the beginning of the universe. If the universe had a beginning, then the universe had a cause. In logical form, the argument goes like this. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. End quote. Okay, straightforward and to the point. Seems like a pretty simple proposition to test. Before we start examining the argument, though, let's be clear on our terminology. And bear with me here, because some of these definitions might sound like belaboring the point, but in a minute y'all will see why it's relevant. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. Okay, so what's a beginning? A beginning is a change in state from not existing to existing, or from not happening to happening. In other words, at some point in time, a certain thing don't exist or a certain process ain't happening, and then at some later point in time it does exist or it is happening, and the point in time where it makes the transition is the beginning. So we got a time before and a time after and a beginning in between, which means that in order to have a beginning, time has to exist before the beginning, so as we can have that before time. So what's a cause? Well, it's some action or process that occurs before the beginning, without which the beginning would not take place. So Geisler and Turek is arguing that the universe has a beginning. So what's the universe? Well, the universe is everything, all of matter and energy and space and time. Except, of course, space and time ain't two different things. They're just different aspects of the same thing, what Einstein called space-time. And again, thanks to Einstein, we know that matter and energy ain't two different things, because matter can become energy, according to Einstein's famous formula, E equals mc squared. And conversely, energy can become matter by the same formula the other way around. So the word universe really means all of space-time and all of energy, whether that energy is in the form of energy or matter. And there's just one more word we need to define, and that's the word origin. An origin is just the minimum value of something. It's like a beginning, except the origin don't need any prior point in time where something didn't exist. For example, speed has an origin of 0. If you has a speed of 0, that's the slowest you can go. You're stationary. Once you come to a complete stop, you can't slow down anymore because you come to a speed of 0, and that's the origin point of all speeds. And we're going to see in a minute why it's important to know that. But meanwhile, let's just go on ahead and see how Geisler and Turek intend to spin this into an argument for the existence of a Genesis creation God. Quote, Premise 1. Everything that had a beginning had a cause is the law of causality, which is the fundamental principle of science. Without the law of causality, science is impossible. If there's one thing we've observed about the universe, it's that things don't happen without a cause. End quote. Sounds reasonable, don't it? We have a general principle based on induction. We make observations in the real world, and we observe that every time something happens, it happens for a reason. Well, except for stuff at the quantum level, of course, but the stuff we can see with our own eyes always seems to happen for a reason. And yet, premise 1 seems off somehow. The law of causality don't say nothing about being limited to things that had a beginning. Geisler and Turek added that part themselves, which seems odd. Maybe we ought to think a little more carefully about what we actually do observe in the real world. For example, we don't never see things actually begin to exist out of nothing. In every cause and effect relationship that we can verifiably observe, what we see is pre-existing matter and or energy being transformed into some new state by some physical process. So I think if Geisler and Turek's going to add arbitrary stipulations to the law of causality, maybe we ought to add our own stipulation based on what we actually do observe. So a more precise and accurate premise 1 would be, quote, every beginning has a prior condition where it has not yet begun, and is produced by physical forces operating on pre-existing matter and energy in accordance with the laws of thermodynamics. End quote. Okay, that's way longer, but it's a lot better because it's literally and precisely everything that we actually observe about causes and effects. If we want to be precise and accurate, that's the most that we can legitimately state as a genuine reality-based inductive principle. Geisler and Turek take a couple paragraphs to argue that the law of causality is fundamentally true and therefore their version of premise 1 must be true. But premise 1 ain't exactly the same as the law of causality, so they're kind of pulling a bait and switch here. Cause and effect is true in the context of observing physical changes and processes that take place in accordance with the laws of physics in the physical world at a macro scale. But that don't mean it would necessarily be true in a different context, like, for example, at the quantum scale. Geisler and Turek's first premise omits important information about the circumstances under which the law of causality applies, and it adds an arbitrary stipulation with undefined terms. So we ain't off to a good start here. But let's move on. Quote, since the law of causality is well established and undeniable, premise 1 is true. What about premise 2? Did the universe have a beginning? If not, then no cause was needed. If so, then the universe must have had a cause. This boils down to a question of whether or not there was ever any time when the universe did not already exist. If there was never any time when the universe did not already exist, then the universe has an origin, not a beginning. Because remember, a beginning is a change in state, a difference between conditions at one point in time and conditions at some later point in time. So in order for the universe to begin to exist, there must have been some point in time when nothing existed. Now, was there ever a point in time when nothing existed? Clearly not, because time itself is something. You can't have a point in time unless time already exists. So there's never been any point in time when nothing existed, because time necessarily exists at every point in time. And remember, time's just one of the aspects of space-time. So if time existed, then space did too. And since the law of conservation of energy tells us that the total amount of energy is constant across time, then energy has also existed at every point in time, because that's what constant means. And since energy can take the form of matter in accordance with E equals mc squared, wherever energy exists, matter also exists, at least potentially. So we know that matter and energy and space and time have all existed for all of time. And that's the universe. There has never been any point in all of time where the universe did not already exist. And therefore, there has never been any point in time where it could have been caused or created. What the universe has, and what physicists found at the Big Bang, is an origin, not a beginning. The universe has existed for all of time, but time itself has an origin that only goes back to about 13.8 billion years ago. If you could travel back in time, you could go as far back as the origin, but no farther. It's like traveling to the North Pole. You can keep going north and north and north and north, but once you get to the pole, you can't go any farther north. It ain't a question of having enough wisdom and power. It ain't like you get to the North Pole and there's some kind of wall or barrier to overcome that's preventing you from going any further north. No, it's once you get to the pole, there ain't no more north to go to. Every step you take beyond the North Pole is a step to the south, no matter which way you turn before you step off. And it's the same way with the origin of the universe. If and you had a working time machine, you could go back and back and back in time. Once you get to the origin, you can't go any further back. It ain't that there's some obstacle to overcome, it's that there's no more past to go back into. So no, the universe did not have a beginning. It had an origin. And for all of time, from now all the way back to the origin, the physical universe has already existed. And like Geisler and Turek said, that means that no cause is needed. It's here because it's always been here for all of time. I don't know if Geisler and Turek understand that, but I suspect that William Lane Craig does, even though he pretends he don't. But that's a topic for another time. Geisler and Turek, meanwhile, is going to drive on obliviously. Quote, "Until about the time of Einstein, atheists could comfort themselves with the belief that the universe is eternal and thus did not need a cause. But since then, 5 lines of scientific reasoning have been discovered that prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the universe did indeed have a beginning, and that beginning was what scientists now call the Big Bang." End quote. And Geisler and Turek go on to list the 5 pieces of evidence for the Big Bang, which they summarize using the acronym SURGE. S for the second law of thermodynamics, U for the expanding universe, R for background radiation, G for great galaxy seeds, and E for Einstein's theory of general relativity. And their discussion of the science involved is about what you'd expect from a couple guys who think Einstein observed the universe visibly expanding through a telescope one night at Mount Wilson. And honestly, I don't see much point in quibbling over the details. Their conclusion is that Big Bang cosmology is more or less correct as far as we know now. Or rather, their conclusion is that the Big Bang is undeniably and absolutely true because they think this proves that Genesis 1 is correct about the origin of the heavens and the earth. But nevertheless, it's still fair to agree that the Big Bang did happen, pending any new information that would invalidate the theory. So let's go back and revisit Geisler and Turek's cosmological argument with the appropriate corrections. The original, sloppy, oversimplified syllogism went like this. Everything that had a beginning had a cause, The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. But that first premise was both overly broad and overly specific, so we fixed it. That kind of broke the syllogism, since the creation of the universe don't logically follow from the premise that material changes in state are produced from prior physical processes. But then again, the second premise was also wrong, so we fixed that one as well. But now the conclusion is wrong. Or rather, it was always wrong, but now we can see that it's wrong. So we fixed that too. So now the conclusion is right, but the logic looks wrong because our first premise don't really have that much to do with the rest of the argument. So let's fix that one too. Let's say this. A thing cannot begin to exist unless there was some point in time when it did not already exist. The universe has existed for all of time, and time itself has an origin point about 13.8 billion years ago. Therefore, the universe cannot have a cause because there was never a time when it did not already exist. And now, finally, we have a valid logical argument based on verifiably true and specific premises. Stated clearly, and strictly according to what we actually observe, the cosmological argument is actually a disproof of divine creation. Geisler and Turek, of course, have no idea how badly they got it wrong, so at this point they start doing their little victory dance. And to help them along, they've invited Dr. Robert Jastrow, founder of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. Jastrow was an agnostic, but the discovery and confirmation of the Big Bang made a huge impression on him. And in 1978, he published a book entitled God and the Astronomers, much to the delight of folks like Geisler and Turek. And after you hear a quote from his book, you'll see why. Quote, "Now we see how the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The details differ, but the essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are the same. The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply at a definite moment in time in a flash of light and energy." End quote. And I think it should be pretty obvious here that Jastrow's indulging himself in a heaping helping of poetic license, especially considering he admits that the details don't actually match up. Yeah, once you take away the details, lots of things is quote-unquote the same. You take away the details and Christianity is the same as Greek mythology, and Jainism, and Satanism. But that ain't the point. The point is that the details are the important part. But believers don't care about none of that, of course. All they care is that a real, genuine scientist is claiming that there's scientific proof that Genesis was right. Well, maybe Jastrow at least made some money off of his book. According to Amazon, the new and expanded edition is the 1,137,024th best-selling book of all time. So that's something, I guess. But here's the catch. Jastrow didn't actually convert to Christianity. He remained an agnostic for the rest of his life, despite his professed belief in the existence of an unknowable supernatural God. According to an interview he had in 1995, science and theology are entirely separate and distinct domains. Christians like to think that the Big Bang confirms Christianity, but according to Jastrow himself, it does not. At best, he thinks it confirms something vaguely similar to early Canaanite creation mythology, but that's a long way short of what Geisler and Turek want it to be. In essence, Jastrow's basically inventing a new flavor of post-Christian deism. And even that's just his personal opinion, which is why he published it in the popular press and not in a peer-reviewed journal. But now, let's look at this from a slightly different perspective. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Jastrow's hyperbolic claims were literally true, and that the Big Bang really was the undeniable scientific proof of God that Geisler and Turek want it to be. Remember that objective reality is consistent with itself, and that every genuine truth necessarily implies other truths that's also going to be consistent with objective reality. So if God has given us tangible, physical, verifiable proof of his existence, what does that imply? Well, obviously, that implies we ain't talking about no hidden, mysterious God. We's talking about a God who's both willing and able to give us solid, verifiable proof of his existence. If he's actually gone and done it, then clearly it must be both possible and desirable from his perspective to do it. And that raises the bar on the kind of evidence we ought to expect and require in order for this God's existence to be proven true beyond a reasonable doubt. Which means that every Christian apologetic around the problem of divine hiddenness goes right out the window. It cannot be simultaneously true both that God has some necessary and sufficient reason why he can't give us solid, verifiable evidence of his existence, and that he does give us solid and verifiable evidence. All those arguments about how to supposedly violate our free will to show up in real life and force us to believe would have to be just so much horse apples. But more than that, if the gospel is true, then God wants to be with us and interact with us and be known by us. So if he's both willing and able to give us verifiable proof of his existence, then he'd be showing up in real life to interact with us just like he wants to. And of course, that ain't what we see at all. So how do we explain that? What hypothesis is most consistent with the available evidence? Well, let's consider two alternative hypotheses. The gospel hypothesis that claims the Christian gospel is true, and the myth hypothesis that claims it's all invented by man. Now, if the myth hypothesis is true, we would expect to see believers rushing to give God credit for every amazing phenomenon they can, because that's basically what myths is. Stories about things we see in the real world that makes us wonder. We'd also expect that we'd never see God actually showing up in real life. We'd expect stories about God showing up in real life and doing amazing things, but we'd never actually see any of that ourselves. And we'd expect to see conflicting apologetics and gospel claims that don't match what we find in objective reality, because the gospel would be false, and by definition false means not consistent with objective reality. So that's what we'd logically expect to see if the myth hypothesis is true. On the other hand, if the gospel hypothesis is true, and if the Big Bang actually was undeniable proof of God's existence, then we'd expect to see other undeniable proofs of God's existence, starting with him showing up routinely in everyday life to interact with us face to face, since the gospel says that's something he wants so bad that he's willing to literally die for it. We'd expect that they wouldn't be no atheists, nor any apologists, since the undeniable proofs of his existence would make the former impossible and the latter unnecessary. They might be some folks who knows that God exists and freely chooses to rebel against him anyway, just like Satan and a third of the angels in heaven supposedly did. But everybody would know that he was there, because he'd show up in real life where we could all see him. So them's the implications of each of the two hypotheses, taken without any additional arbitrary ad hoc assumptions that we shove in there to try and account for inconsistencies between the hypothesis and the evidence. So which one's a better fit? Which one most closely matches our observation of believers rushing to give some kind of God credit for the Big Bang in a world where God only shows up in stories and legends and don't actually show up in real life where we can all see him? Which hypothesis has to inject an additional apologetic around so-called divine hiddenness in order to try and explain God's failure to show up where we can all see him? I think it's pretty obvious, don't you? There's definitely a lot more that could be said, but you know what? That's going to do it for me for today. Next time, Geisler and Turek is going to try and address some of the atheistic responses to the cosmological argument, so he's going to have lots more opportunity to dig into this topic. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.